Morning, everyone. Thanks for being here today. We're excited to have a big group joining us today to learn all about the anatomy of an IEP. And I got this idea to do this presentation when I was helping a parent go through her IEP. And I have sort of a way that I approach dissecting the IEP or marking it up. And I have little techniques that I use and some strategies. And as I was giving her feedback about the IEP, I thought this is something every parent should know how to do. And then as I decided to put this presentation, was working on this presentation, I realized this is something that I really wished I'd had as a newer parent when my son still had an IEP. He doesn't have an IEP anymore. He's 19 and in college now. So anyway, I'm really thrilled to bring this to you, but so that's the good news. The bad news is I have to split this into two parts. There was too much material. And even though I was cutting like mad, we need 2 hours to do this. So I also want to make sure there's time for questions. I want to go nice and slow so that we don't get confused because there's a lot of confusing stuff. And a reminder that both sessions are recorded. I'll be sharing them with you after today's session. And I am going to do part 2 next Thursday at 10 a.m. Pacific, and I'll send you that information and the meeting link after today's session. So just backing up a little bit about me, those of you who don't know me, my name is Audrey Vernick. I'm the Director of Patient and Family Advocacy for the Pediatric Epilepsy Surgery Alliance. We used to be the Brain Recovery Project. We are now the Pediatric Epilepsy Surgery Alliance. And I have been working with Monica Jones and this organization since 2015. And I am the parent to a young man who had a hemispherectomy when he was 2. He had a stroke in utero and infantile spasms, and then had a subsequent hemispherectomy. And my role is to help families navigate the educational system and develop IEPs for their children. I provide some direct advocacy, very limited, more through kind of parent support. And then parent training via workshops, webinars, guides, presentations, etc. And my job is to help you understand all areas of suspected disability that your child might have, how to request assessments from your school district, how do you help your school team understand the implications of the child's impairments. And yes, you heard me right, you have to teach the school team how to understand the implications of your child's impairments, as crazy as that sounds, and then what are the accommodations needed for the student. And we also provide school training to school teams, which has been very well received by the teams that we've worked with. And if you haven't already done a school training for your team, I would recommend that you check it out. That link will also be shared with you after today's session. Those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, the Pediatric Epilepsy Surgery Alliance was founded in 2011. And if anyone's unmuted, I think if someone unmute, if you could mute, that would be helpful. Thank you. We are dedicated to serving the community of children who are anywhere on the epilepsy surgery journey. And we have a variety of programs and ways in which we do that. I will also be sharing the link to our website and a bunch of other resources that we've created after today's session. I also want to highlight that next week we have, not next week, in 2 weeks we have a presentation. I'm very, very lucky that we got Julie Gardner to agree to come and do this for us, and it was actually her idea on the topic. And that topic is empowering the parent's voice in the IEP process. So while I'll touch on some of that today, I'm not really going to go into strategy. I'm not going to talk about what do you do when the school says no. That's not the focus of today's talk. That's what Julie's going to cover. So if you have questions that you want to email us in advance, please do so. You can do it on the registration form. Again, I'll be sending that link out after today's session. So please don't miss that one. I think it'll be great. So,
Audrey?
Yes.
I'm sorry, could I interrupt you for 1 second?
Of course.
I had posted on Facebook that I hadn't received the link, but then I did end up getting it. I do have somebody reaching out to me trying to get in because she doesn't have the link.
Okay.
Are you okay with me sending it to her?
Yes, please.
Okay.
And sorry about that.
Well, that's okay.
The registration is only through the Airtable form. So sometimes people think if they like it, if they say I'm going on Facebook, it means they're going. You have to
Right.
actually click through the Airtable. But yes, if anyone's on here and has a friend trying to get in, go ahead and share the link. I will let them in. No Zoom bombers, please. And one thing I did want to say about today, you're welcome to unmute and ask questions, interrupt me anytime. This session is for you. It's to help you. Just know that it is being recorded. So if you unmute and speak, your image will appear on the recording and your name. If you want to remain more anonymous, you can put your questions in the chat and I will be looking at the chat throughout the presentation. So one of the mottos of our organization, and particularly our parent advocacy supports, is that knowledge is power. So if you're going to advocate for something for your child, you must understand it. I will also say that sometimes I hear parents having hesitation about advocating for their child. They're worried about getting the school mad at them or that the teachers won't like the child, things like that. My response to that is your child can't advocate for themselves yet. So your goal is to teach them to self-advocate. And I have a 19-year-old son who is on the verge of self-advocating and is still not doing that independently and will probably need support for several more years with that. But our kids aren't capable of doing it, so we have to do it for them. So the other thing to remember in all of this is that this process is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And it's really important to keep that in mind, that it takes time to understand all of this, and it's going to take time to go through all of it. I think it's worth it in the end. I know some people opt out and homeschool because they get so sick of the IEP process, and that is part of it. I did send all of you in advance, everyone who registered, our webinar series. We have a 5-part series on YouTube that does discuss advocacy styles. It does walk through the process of the IEP process. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but please check out those existing YouTube videos that we have. So today we're just going to talk about the IEP document. We're going to dissect it. I called it the anatomy, but it's truly a dissection. I want to show you what matters, how you can include parent input into each part of the IEP. And the purpose of all of it is to ensure that your child receives an appropriate education. And you'll notice I never say the word best. I always say appropriate because that's what the law says. We don't get what's best for our kids. We get what's appropriate. All right. So there's a lot to learn when you have a child who's had epilepsy surgery. It's very complicated. You need to learn about the brain. You need to learn about the child's surgery and its effects. If you don't understand what surgery your child had or what the impact of the child's surgery was, it's really, really important that you understand that. You need to understand your child's disabilities, which is part of the IEP process and evaluating for assessments. You need to understand the IEP process, and you need to understand what interventions and teaching strategies work best for a child with your child's unique profile based on their disability and their learning profile. So today we're just talking about this one part in the IEP process. And honestly, we're just talking about one part of the IEP process, which is the document itself. So what is an IEP? We all know that it's incredibly excessive paperwork. And I'm not going to read the slide to you, but just a reminder, this stuff is really complicated. It's a process, and there are a lot of things that you can do to make it go smoother. But what an IEP is, an individualized education plan, it's a written statement that's developed for each eligible child with a qualifying disability, age 3 to 21, who attends a traditional public or charter school. And the IEP documents your child's current performance, their learning goals, the supports and services they need, and what is needed to help your child be successful and progress towards their goals and access the general ed curriculum. And then the IDEA, I'm going to be sending you the text of the IDEA and a bunch of highlighted chapters from today's session. But it's section 300, 320 that outlines the requirements that must be part of the IEP. Monica just put in the chat, an IEP is not a contract, it's a statement. If the school doesn't follow the IEP, it's not an automatic violation like it would be if they signed a contract with you. Again, today we're going to talk more about the nuts and bolts of the document and less about strategy, but that's an excellent point. So what is the purpose of an IEP? So when you look at the language, if you haven't read IDEA, I highly recommend that you read it, at least the preamble, and really understand what Congress meant when they created the IDEA. But what the law says is that over 20 years of research, it has been demonstrated that children with disabilities can be made more effective by having high expectation for children and ensuring their access to the gen ed curriculum maximum extent possible. So these are kind of some key words and phrases you want to kind of keep in your back of your mind when you're creating your child's IEP. Does the team have high expectations for your child? And does your child have access to the general education curriculum as much as possible? So the steps in the IEP process, this is outlined again in our webinar series on YouTube. We have a 5-part series on YouTube that just goes through the entire process. Today, we're going to talk about step 4, which is developing the IEP. So there are a lot of parts to the IEP. This is my latest checklist of what is on an IEP document or in an IEP. The order is going to vary depending on your state and what form they use, and some things might not be included and other things might be included. So these are the parts we're going to discuss today and next week, again, because we're going to split this into 2 parts so we can go nice and slow. When you are looking at your child's IEP, if your child already has an IEP, ask yourself, does your child's IEP accurately reflect the child and what the child needs? And if your answer to that question is no, then think about what you need to do. You either need better assessments, because the assessments are the foundation of the IEP. Maybe the child is missing a neuropsychological assessment, which is critical for a child who's had epilepsy or epilepsy surgery. Maybe you need other evaluations that have been missed, like an auditory processing evaluation or a vision evaluation or a detailed literacy assessment, something to give you the team more information. Maybe goals, maybe the IEP lays out all the areas of need, but there aren't goals developed in all of the areas that are essential for learning. And we'll talk about later about how not every need is a goal, but the bulk of what your child's needs are related to accessing and making progress in the curriculum is essential. And then lastly, sometimes it's a pretty good IEP, which is the examples I'm going to show you today. We're pretty good IEPs, but the team's not doing what's in the IEP. So those are some things to think about as you think about your child's IEP. So first part of the IEP on almost every IEP is demographic data. So this is going to include the name, address, and possibly the eligibility of the child. So I'm going to show you a couple of actual IEPs just to give you an example. And again, each school district, each state is going to have their own form. So it might look different for you, but I just want you to start to get really comfortable and familiar with how do you find information on this very, very dense and complex document. I don't know about you all, but my son's IEP by the time he graduated was, I think, 110 pages long. So it's War and Peace. It's quite the novel. Here's another example of the demographic data page. And you'll notice on this one, at the bottom, it lists the areas of disability. And in this case, in California, you can list 2 areas of eligibility, not disability, eligibility, which is different, which is explained in our webinar series. There's 2 areas of eligibility listed here, and you can actually name even more. So some states say you only can have 1. If a state tells you that, you still want to describe in the statement that would go after this, what is the extent of the child's disability and how does it impact them? And if there are other eligibility categories, to name them. I can talk more about eligibility categories if anyone has any questions about that. Okay. And then you'll notice here that this is the
Audrey?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I did have a question about the eligibility.
Great.
I'm in New York. Is it the same thing as a classification?
I don't know. Julie or Monica, do you know? Can I out you?
Yes, it's the same thing. New York calls it classification, and you have different classification categories up there, but it's the same thing. It's a primary disability is what you're looking for.
Yeah.
Okay.
The
And
federal law calls it the eligibility. So it's basically saying your child can have a disability, but being eligible for an IEP under whatever eligibility category. So yeah, I guess up there it's called classification, right?
yeah. So in your opinion, after a child has epilepsy surgery, is there a certain hierarchy for the classifications? Meaning, if I'm only allowed one to choose on the IEP, should I choose the one that is, I don't even know how to, more, I don't want to say more important, but more applicable to the surgery?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And we could spend a bit of time on this. I'll try to give a brief answer and then I might need to follow up with a longer answer later. You'll notice on this one, this is actually my son's IEP, I will admit. On this one, we've listed VI first, visual impairment, and then OHI second, which is other health impairment. Initially, his IEP listed visual impairment and orthopedic impairment, and he had a hemispherectomy, so he had his brain disconnected to stop his seizures. Does visual impairment or orthopedic impairment really capture the full spectrum of a child with a hemispherectomy? No. Why is visual impairment first? In our case, visual impairment is first because of low incidence funding. And I believe most states have categories that are so of eligibility that are so rare, but they require additional training services and supports that the states get extra funding for the kids that have that eligibility category on their IEP. Is that a reason to choose that? No. But in our case, our team we had a secondary that we could list, and also our team was willing to let us write the IEP for the most part, putting a lot of parent input, which just know as parents, you're absolutely within your right to offer parent input into each section of the IEP. This description of how the disability affects involvement and progress in general curriculum that you see below, I wrote that. The team did not write that, right? So back to your question, I have seen families in states where they only allow one eligibility category. I have heard teams say it has to be TBI. There's a question about whether or not a brain surgery is actually a TBI. It's technically not. It's technically an acquired brain injury, but I see many IEPs that have TBI listed. And actually, personally, I'm okay with that because I think the understanding that this is the way a traumatic brain injury presents, there's a lot of not visible disabilities, invisible disabilities. And so having that perspective could be helpful. Other teams will say the child has to be listed under multiple disabilities. And the problem with multiple disabilities, again, I don't have a problem with it and I'll explain why in a second, but a problem could be that oftentimes in states that use the multiple disabilities category, they're basically saying this child is so impaired in multiple areas that there's a floor of expectations for this child. So that's something to think about. That's not technically what's supposed to happen, but that could happen. But let me let you in on a little secret that I found out about halfway through my child's educational journey. If the child was found eligible initially for speech or OHI because of epilepsy even, right? And had no other impairments and they had an IEP and you never changed their eligibility, can they receive services in other areas of eligibility that are added, even if it's not listed on the IEP as the primary? And the answer is yes. And the other thing is they don't even need to meet criteria for eligibility in another category to receive services in that area if the team agrees that the services are needed. So what I'm saying is your child could have a speech IEP or an OHI, other health impaired IEP, because you're dealing with epilepsy and medications and whatnot, and then have a hemispherectomy or another major epilepsy surgery and have multiple needs in multiple areas and would still have access to those services despite what the primary eligibility is listed on the IEP. Now, again, it kind of depends on how your team looks at it. You want to work with your team, but this is a very nuanced topic, and I'm sorry, I don't have a very clear-cut answer. I want to make it clear, though, it's essential to assess the child in all areas of disability, which I'll talk about here in a second. You don't want to miss that. But the eligibility category only matters as so much as it matters to your team. So if your IEP team is basically like, we won't give you X service unless you have X eligibility category, okay, fine. give them X eligibility category. But know that even with a multiple disabilities category, they still have to provide what the child requires to access the general educational curriculum, make progress and on their IEP goals, and be included with their peers, right? It doesn't matter. Someone has a hand raised.
Yeah, excuse me, Audrey, that's me, Amy.
Mhm.
I just want to say, so I came from California. My son had this similar surgery to yours. I came from California where the visual impairment was the primary because of low incidence, and moved to New York. I'm here now. And so we had visual impairment as primary and OHI as secondary, and then physical disability as tertiary. When we moved here and we transferred documents, the special education department immediately looked at the cover page, which has the eligibility categories and not the statement, and started exploring vision programs. And not until we could connect with them and explain it did they understand that there was so much more going on, because they just started down a path without really delving into the IEP.
Yeah.
We have since changed the eligibility because it's not a low incidence here, but that is something to encourage people, if there's a possibility of transitioning to a different district or something else, making sure that you're very clear in the document right up front, because that was a hurdle for us.
Yeah. And so let's just quickly look at what I wrote now that you all know that it's what I wrote. So what it said on my son's IEP before was visual impairment, and then it was orthopedic impairment. We actually argued to change it to OHI as a secondary because of the complexity of his disability. And do you know what's was written under to describe how students' disability affects involvement and progress in the general curriculum? Nothing. There was nothing written there. So as a parent, if you allow any part of your child's IEP to remain blank, you are doing a disservice to your child and to the IEP team. So anyone who picks up your child's IEP, it needs to pass the stranger test. So let's say your para is sick, your teacher is sick, everybody who knows the child is out with COVID. This actually happened to a friend of mine last year during the beginning of Omicron. And a sub comes in and picks up your child's IEP at a glance, which would have this on it. They need to be able to quickly skim it and know, oh my God, this child is very complex, and I'm going to spend an extra minute here, making sure I understand what's going on. Without this description down, oops, excuse me, my mouse is always touchy when I'm on Zoom. This part here, if the person came in and saw VI and OHI, run of the mill kid, right? Like maybe VIs are kind of rare, but there's a vision teacher in the building who's going to come help. No big deal. But you really need to make sure that you're explaining the child's disability in this section of the IEP. Very important. Okay. So let's think about the IEP team. Some of you have attended meetings like this where there were this many people in the room, maybe not quite this many, but somewhere in the IEP document is going to be a list of the team members and signatures for attendance. You would like to sign for attendance when you attend the meeting, but never sign agreement during the meeting. You want to make sure you have time to review the IEP afterwards, make any corrections, et cetera, so you don't ever feel pressure to sign in the meeting. But the IEP team includes the parent or parents, and sometimes the student. Definitely by transition age, the student must be included. And as important members of the IEP team. So it is not that the school makes a decision and then the parent has, gets to say something. No, the parent is an equal member of the IEP team. Other required members are the special education teacher, a representative from the local education agency. This has to be someone who can commit the resources of the district. It can't just be a principal from another school or, kind of a middle level administrator. If that person's not in the room and you get to a point where you have a question that can't be answered because that person's not in the room, then you stop the meeting and you say, please call that person and let's get them on speakerphone or let's reschedule this meeting. Someone who can interpret the instructional implications of any evaluation results. So that means if you're having a meeting to discuss an evaluation, it would be really great to have the evaluator present who conducted that evaluation. And again, if your child has, certain needs, you're going to want that certain person in the IEP meeting all the time. So if the child has behaviors and that behaviorist is not in every IEP meeting, you can't really design a meaningful IEP without that person present. Someone who can interpret the instructional implications of those evaluation results. And then the gen ed teacher, I've seen language that says if the student is or may be participating in the regular environment. I would argue that for the most part, the gen ed teacher is always part of the IEP team because the student should have some level of inclusion. But you as a parent do have a right to opt out of that, not have that person. And then some schools will have other requirements, like that there has to be a vocational specialist, that there has to be a teacher of the gifted if the student is a student with a disability who is also gifted, et cetera. This is going to be varying state by state. Okay, special factors. This is a portion of the IEP that the team must consider before developing the IEP, and factors checked yes must be addressed in the IEP. Just anyone want to shout out or raise your hand? How many of you have looked at, read, and understand the special factors page in your IEP, in your child's IEP? Someone, I got one hand raised. Anyone else? 2, 3, 4. Okay. So a small percentage of you. And Julie made a comment, I'll just back up. Legally, the gen ed teacher can be the PE teacher, but if your child has academic concerns, you can request an academic teacher. Good point. I didn't include PE in this presentation because it was getting too long. But let me just talk a little bit about special factors. I think this is one of the most important pages of the IEP, and most people don't look at it or understand what it is, and I'll show you why in a minute. So what the law says is that the IEP team must, in the case, consider the following special factors: the behavior that impedes the child's learning or that of others. So if the child is inattentive and doesn't pay attention in class, or frequently goes to the school nurse because they don't want to be in the room, or hits other students, or puts his head down on his desk and takes a nap during language arts, is that a behavior that impedes the child's learning? Yes. And most IEP teams will not evaluate a child unless they're throwing furniture across the room. So if there is any behavior, and the example IEP I'm going to show you all over this IEP are examples of the behavior that impedes the child's access to learning, but the school has not done a functional behavior assessment and they don't consider it they don't look at it this way. Limited English proficiency. So if the child speaks English as a second language, there are some considerations that need to be made relating to the child's IEP. If the child is blind or visually impaired, the law says they have to provide for instruction in Braille unless the IEP team determines after an evaluation of the child's reading and writing skills that instruction in Braille is not appropriate. So it's very specific to Braille. But interestingly, the communication needs of the child, for the child who is deaf or hard of hearing, says that you have to consider the child's language and communication needs. You have to consider the full range of needs, including opportunities for direct instruction in the child's language and communication mode. So for you AAC users out there, this is your key piece. You're going to have this language. I'm going to be sending this to you, my notes with the slides, so you'll have this exact language from the law. Is the school presenting the material to your child in the language and communication mode, how your child needs to receive it? And it's also relevant to a child with central auditory processing disorder. Even though it says deaf or hard of hearing, we're looking at the communication mode. And then assistive technology, devices and services, which is something that is always, I think, done poorly in most IEPs. We can get to that. So here's just an example now of what, I'm going to give you 2 examples of a special factors page. And again, this all started because I was looking at this parent's IEP and I started marking it up and I thought, let's go through this, right? So this child is particularly, does have a visual impairment. And so the team noted that the child does have a visual impairment, but is not going to need Braille instruction. So that's fine. Is the child deaf or hard of hearing? So technically under IDEA, CAPD, central auditory processing disorder, does not fall under this category. So I would add to your parent concerns or somewhere in the IEP, if your child has a central auditory processing disorder, that while the student's name doesn't meet the IDEA definition of deaf or hard of hearing, when the ear opposite the removed hemisphere is extinguished in multiple sound environments. This is true of a child who has had a temporal lobectomy or corpus callosotomy as well. That there can be corpus callosotomy, it's a little bit different, but any child who's had a temporal lobectomy, or I think even amygdala hippocampectomy, Monica can correct me if I'm wrong, because I think they have to go through the auditory cortex to remove that. Regardless, if your child has had any impact to the temporal lobe, a TPO, hemispherectomy, there should be an auditory processing evaluation. And then we're looking at the communication needs, right? So even separate from the deaf and hard of hearing, what are the communication needs? It might be that they need instruction in a quiet room. It might mean that they need an AAC device. Julie's commenting that you want to make sure that it's included in the present levels of academic and functional performance before you get to this page. So I mentioned at the beginning, these pages are in different order on different IEPs. So I'm putting it in the order that it was on this IEP that I looked at, which was from Pennsylvania. So yes, but very important that you want to, we'll talk about functional and academic here in a second. Oops, sorry. All right. And then assistive technology. So the student needs must be addressed in the IEP. As you'll see on the next special factors example, you can actually list on some forms which tools they're using, and then does the student exhibit behaviors that impede learning of that or others? So I want you to think about that this box was not checked on this child's IEP as we look at the IEP, because they're saying that this child does not. And so we know the student has ADHD, and you can request a full FBA to determine any antecedent behavior consequence data that collected in multiple settings across the school day or several different days, different times of days. And then a BCBA or a board certified behavior analyst can help the team develop a behavior intervention plan. The idea is to be proactive rather than reactive, because what I see is the child being punished or pulled out for behavior. And instead we want the team to know that the behavior, there's antecedents to the behavior, and also understanding the whole disability is important. Someone asked a question about comorbid hearing loss and has audiology DHH on the IEP. Would an auditory processing evaluation still apply? I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because we don't have time today, but I will say that I don't think it's possible to assess a child with hearing loss for a CAPD fully. But the CAPD, Dr. Tammy Riegner, who co-wrote our auditory guide, cortical auditory impairment guide, said that when you have a peripheral hearing loss, the central hearing system is cortically deprived of auditory information. So it kind of results in a central auditory processing disorder as well. So it's kind of a double whammy, but it's impossible to assess for. If you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to talk to you more about this and get you some more information. All right, so here's another example of that special factors page. And you'll see that there's a lot more description here for each tool used, that the items are in a different order, right? There's some different questions, like the low incidence services is on our form in California. So it just looks a little bit different. Again, a lot of these things I wrote. So for example, the considerations if he's blind, the team didn't really understand his visual impairment. So I wrote out a lot of what I felt belonged in different sections and gave it to the specialist and said to the vision teacher, this needs to go in special factors, et cetera. And then you'll notice here that I dropped the ball on the considerations if the student is deaf and hard of hearing. Here, where it just says NA, it should have been written out, but I do have it addressed in other parts of this IEP. And then the behavior piece. So again, at this point, I think my son was in 6th or 8th grade. Behavior was not an issue for him, but it certainly was an issue when he was younger. So you just want to make sure you're always checking that. Rural county BOEs in Alabama. I don't, but I'm happy to, again, you can reach out to me directly, Vernick at epilepsysurgeryalliance.org, and I'm happy to answer any one-on-one questions. The next section of the IEP is the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. You'll notice on the little chart I made of all the parts of the IEP, I said it's not PLOP, it's PLAF. Even though we can't say it, it's PLAF, because PLOP is present levels of performance. It doesn't tell us that we're always considering academic achievement and functional performance. So, so, so important, especially for kids that have something more than an academic challenge. All right, so let's talk about what this section would need to contain, the PLAF. Okay, so it describes your child's current performance, strengths, and needs. How is your child currently achieving in school today, right now, not 6 months ago, not a year ago, right now? What is the present level of academic achievement, functional performance? It describes the effects of the student's disability on their involvement and progress in the general education curriculum. So what you're doing with this is you're asking what special education and related services will help my child participate in the general education curriculum, meaning study what other students are studying, or at least have access to that content. And you're also asking what special education related services or supports will help my child participate in extracurricular activities such as school clubs or sports. Both are relevant to the IEP. You want to include the strengths of the students and the needs that are resulting from the disability, that both academic and functional. And all of this has to be based on measurable current assessments and baseline data collection. So Nicole helped me yesterday. She's our curriculum specialist. I think that's your title. We were talking about the difference between those annual evaluations and then the current baseline data. You need both to develop the PLAF. But in order to write goals, you need that current baseline data. But in order to write the PLAF, you need that annual evaluation. It might be every 3 years, et cetera, but you need that comprehensive evaluation. And then the last piece is parent concerns. The last piece I'm mentioning right now, it's not necessarily the last piece. It should be the first piece. I think it should go at the top of the parent concern section, and that's generally where I see it. Again, it depends on what your IEP looks like, but there should be a section in the IEP that says concerns of parent relevant to the child's educational progress or program, something like that. This is such an important tool because everything you list as an educational concern in the IEP must be addressed somewhere in the IEP. Another thing I did not know until well into my child's IEP process, if you write something in your parent concerns that the team is ignoring, now they have to not ignore it. So they have to either assess or provide goals, accommodations, and services for that need, or both, ideally both. Sometimes people ask, how long can this parental concerns letter be? And I think I've seen some very long ones. I've seen some very short ones. One point is the district can't limit how long it is. So they can't say you only have 200 characters. This is not a tweet, okay? We're not tweeting about our child. We're listing everything that is a true concern that you have for this academic year about your child, because you're going to write one every year, maybe more often, maybe every IEP, and you might have multiple IEPs a year. I used to update mine with every IEP, and we had 4 to 5 IEP meetings a year. Be reasonable, keep it simple, create a short, concise bullet list of the areas that are the most important things that you want the IEP team to focus on this year. And you can also write your own parent input for each area of the PLAF, which I will go through as we discuss this section. And I'm going to keep saying PLAF, even though I can't really say it. So you remember it's always PLAF and never PLOP. So this is what the law says about what the PLAF is. Present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, involvement and progress in the general educational curriculum. For preschool, it would be slightly different. It's important that there should be a direct relationship between the present levels of performance and the other components of the IEP. That's from the regulations, another fun document to read if you have time. So if you leave today with one image in your mind, Monica created this, Monica Jones, our founder and executive director. This is the PLAF man. So PLAF man is always in your mind when you walk into that IEP meeting, because he is the foundation of your IEP. If you don't have a good PLAF, you can't have a good IEP. It's impossible. And so these are all of the assessments build PLAF man, right? So he's built on all of those, that comprehensive evaluation in all areas of suspected disability. And he supports all of these other areas. Well, we should make her a she, but anyway, they support all the other areas. The PLAF has to address all of the students' educational needs identified in evaluation. And that's key. So if you have not had an evaluation to identify a need, but you know the child has the need, then you need to request an evaluation in that area. If the evaluation wasn't comprehensive, then the PLAF and the IEP can't be comprehensive. So don't be afraid of assessment. I know sometimes parents are like, well, I don't want to, do another assessment, or they're tired of assessing or whatever. You need the assessments to find out what your child needs, and that drives the goals and services. So not every need becomes a goal, but you really want to make sure that every need is evaluated so that you understand. And then you want to focus on the important needs. What are the top 3 needs that your child has for this coming year? Can you pick just 3? Right? So you really want to think about what's important. Why do I say 3? Because if your child has 50 IEP goals, it's not going to be a good IEP. It's not that there's a limit on the number of goals, but I like to each year for my child's IEP, I would focus on the things that I thought were the most critical. It's not that I completely ignored everything else. And that changed over the years. So it might have been behaviors in elementary school, but then it was social skills in middle school. It might have been learning how to read in elementary school, and then it became more pragmatics of conversation or math. By high school, I was more focused on a diploma track, right? So it's going to change over year to year. The present levels of academic achievement has to be based on this information about the student's current academic achievement. We're looking at reading, writing, math, maybe science and social studies, history, and it's from the most recent evaluation of the student. It can also include, it doesn't have to be the formal evaluations, the diagnostic evaluations. It can also include, how did they do on their previous IEP goals? What are the class and teacher assessments? What about observations, both yours and the school's observations, right? So if you're seeing something at home, you're doing work with the child at home and you're seeing something different, write that statement up of what you witness at home and have that put into the PLAF under academic achievement, right? Lots of different ways that you can look at this data. And then functional performance, again, it's data-based student-specific information about the student's current functional performance in all of these areas. So again, how are we getting this data? All of the ways we just described before. So we want to, and maybe more, maybe looking at related service provider evaluations, et cetera. So let's see what one looks like. And again, this parent had to suffer me marking up the IEP wildly. So, so the first thing the teacher reports in the PLAF, you'll notice, is that the student may have some behavior problems, such as calling out his name loudly, pushing his desk away, and refusing to do work. Did they indicate on the special factors page that this child might have behavior that impedes his learning? Nope. So I ask in gen ed class, why in that setting? This child has a central auditory processing disorder. So my first thought is the classroom is too loud for him and he can't process information or function in that environment. And so he's behaving because he's not able to access information, and that's the response, right? So you always want to look at what's underneath, but you also might want to consider a functional behavior assessment. And then the parent mentioned that the teacher moves in and out of the child's visual field, and the child has a vision impairment. He needs flexible preferential seating so that he's always positioned with the instructor in the visual field. Looking at the data, some of this data was based not on grade level content. It was based on the previous grade level content. I understand what they were trying to do. They were trying to show where he was compared to last year. But what we want to do is look at what progress is he making. Are we looking at second grade data? This child was going into second grade. So we want to be assessing where writing goals for second grade and assessing at first grade level, et cetera. And then down here in the reading assessment, they use something called a cadence benchmark assessments. I don't know anything about this. Every district uses their own evaluation. Everyone's going to have their own benchmarking system. That's fine. But you as a parent need to know what system they're using. You need to research it, and you need to ask the team and find out if it's the appropriate assessment for your student. Is it the appropriate intervention? And is it the appropriate assessment? And then the other thing is this, at the beginning of the year, the students take 3 assessments and then they add these others later. Is that appropriate for this child, right? So you want to look at where are his reading skills, and if he needs assessment in other areas, everything has to be individualized and based on what that child needs. So this was parent input. I'm going to share this example with you today after we finish. I'll be sending you an email that has parent input for every section. And this is an example that someone wrote, another parent wrote, okay? So let's just go back here. This is what the teacher wrote about this student, up above. So-and-so is a first grade student in Mrs. Jones's class at Happy Elementary. He's identified as a student with multiple disabilities and current receives learning support services. That's the statement, right? This is the statement the parent wrote to counter that. I'm not saying it was exactly the same statement, but let's say it was close. So you can write your own parent input and ask for it to be put into the IEP. Again, I'll be sharing that document with you. This is just an example. I'm not going to read through it all. You're going to be getting all of this after today. Another thing that I want to teach you is something I call stepping on the gas. And this is my funny little acronym because I'm silly. When I go through an IEP, I'm highlighting, circling, and writing. And I will highlight an area with a line and then I'll write G next to it. And then I'll highlight something else and I'll write A. And I'll highlight something else and write S. Or I might write G/A/S. Because I think that that area needs a goal, accommodation, or service. And I'm looking at my evaluations this way and my IEP this way. So then when you go into the IEP meeting, you have your marked up evaluation and say, I don't see any goals in this area, but I have G's like all through this report that there should be. Can we talk about whether or not goals are needed? And then when you look through the IEP, the same thing. Like I said, this IEP is very dense with information. There's a lot of good information here. I don't think the team fully understands this child's IEP that they wrote for him, and I don't think they're implementing it. I think that's some of the problem, right? So, all right, let's look at this. Sorry, touchy mouse. Let's look at some of this information. So the assessment took place in the learning support room. So that's a red flag for me, because if there's any extraneous noise, if there's other kids present, if the lighting wasn't appropriate, and this child has an auditory processing disorder and multiple visual impairments. I'm going to read the comment here in the chat. A teacher once wrote that one of my daughter's interests was sleeping. This was a time when her seizures were out of control and we were changing meds. Good Lord, you got to write your own and submit it, because some teachers just don't know your child the way you do. That is such a beautiful example. Thank you for sharing that. Again, I think there's a lot of cut and paste too. Like if you go through your child's IEP and there's another student's name in there, you know that they did not pay a lot of attention to what they were writing. And this was not from the heart about your kid. And I see that all the time. All right, so back to this question here. So again, I'm going to look at, when I look through the IEP, I'm looking at, are they telling us about the assessments they did? What are they? What is this Acadience reading benchmark? I want to learn what it is. Where was the assessment done? You might also want to ask, did you do it over one session or over multiple sessions? And is that how the assessment is normed? Is it supposed to be done in 5 minutes, or can it be done over 5 days, et cetera? You want to really understand what they're using to create this benchmark data that they're using to drive your child's IEP, right? It says here that after each subtest, the child was given a break. So is taking a break a part of the assessment? Is this breaking the norm? Does he need an accommodation that he gets a break after every question in class? If he was given a break after each subtest on the testing and he doesn't have that accommodation in class, why? So again, you want to really be looking at what they're saying about what they're doing and is it accurate? When he was given this support, he began to segment words. So this step jumped out to me because they were basically saying he couldn't do the phoneme segmentation without the support, but once he was given the support, he could. So I'm not a literacy specialist. I'm not going to tell you what the correct instructional methodology here is, but let's talk to the literacy specialist about this. Why did it work when he was given the support? How would you measure this? And what support is needed in the classroom to support this? Again, I'm looking at goal, accommodation, service in some of these areas that I've highlighted. We see in the testing results that he clearly does better with more time. How much time is he given? So I'm going to pause here for a minute and get on my soapbox about memory, working memory, and processing speed, which I think I don't want to speak out of turn. I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not a clinician, and I'm not an educator. But I think that my understanding from what I've seen in the literature is that working memory and processing speed are impaired across a wide spectrum of individuals who have had epilepsy, period. And then those with epilepsy surgery, it may be even more pronounced, particularly those with the hemispheric procedures like hemispherectomy, TPO, et cetera. Sometimes, often, I see accommodations in an IEP that say extended time, give the student more response time, but the teacher has no idea how impaired the child's processing speed is, and they've never measured really how much time the child needs to respond and in what setting. So this is where your neuropsychological evaluation is going to be really helpful. You can't just say the child needs more time. You need to understand why and what setting and how much, and the teacher needs to be trained in it, and they need to do it all the time, right? So that's something just really important. I just wanted to throw that in there. So I made some notes here about switching to another task, preferred task coming back. I talked about how our kids cannot generalize skills across environments. They need practice on each skill in other places. He might need to be assessed in multiple settings to determine the appropriate setting for instruction in each setting. And again, here I noted that it says here that as protocol for the assessment, blah, blah, blah. So now, is this a timed measure? So again, we really want to understand what the assessment, how it was done, et cetera. So when you're in the IEP meeting, and this is all, you're looking at this for the first time, I hope you're stopping your team and saying, I don't understand this. Can you explain this to me? And really going through it like this. It's really, really important that you as a parent understand your child's IEP, because this is how you're going to help access for the services they need. Here's another page of that. So I'm seeing a backwards slide here in this chart. So I'm saying he needs to build on these skills and not go backwards. This is where data is essential. So I would be saying here to the team, what do we need to change so that he's going forward and not backward? Is it the setting? Is it the type of instruction? Is it the frequency of instruction? How many times per week or per day? Is it the intensity? How many minutes? The training of the teacher, how do we assess this? I'm going to go back to Julie's comment. Processing speed deficits should not equate to extra time. Shortened assignments may be a better option. Show competence with less repetition. 5 problems instead of 10 also helps with cognitive fatigue. Excellent point, Julie. We're creating a new guide right now called our Education Resource Guide, which will be released maybe next week. I will share that with you. And we're talking a lot about accommodations there. So I will make sure to describe that well in that document. Training of the teacher, I need to have a separate conversation about that. I think that when we get to the end, when we talk about supports for school personnel, I can loop back into training for the teacher, and I'm going to try to find some resources that I can share with you in the interim. And no apologies for typing slow, Julie. I'll just stop and come back to it. All right. Oh, sorry. Let's go back and look at this one. So again, you're just looking at what they're saying in the IEP and the data they're giving you. And if you don't know what it means, what is 6 correct with 43% accuracy compared to 2 correct with 18% accuracy, which happened 3 months later, right? And why is that? Teams will argue some days the child is tired, some days there's a field trip and they're excited, some days there's distraction, which is why we assess over time. That's fine, but you need to understand that. And you need to talk about what needs to change in terms of the type, delivery, intensity, and frequency of instruction if the child is not making consistent forward progress. And don't be afraid to stop the team and ask questions so that you understand this. On this section, I noticed this teacher had an advanced clinician in remedial vision and rehabilitation. I didn't know what that was. So I asked the question on this document, what is this? Is it a certificate? How many hours of training was it? How much did the training address the vision disorders that this child has? Because epilepsy surgery, one of the primary disabilities after epilepsy surgery is hemianopia or quadrantanopia and visual processing. If your child has had occipital lobectomy, temporal lobectomy, or a hemispherectomy TPO, they're going to have one of these. And a lot of our kids will have a visual processing disorder. A lot of these vision teacher trainings don't cover those areas. They look at other things like acuity and maybe ocular motor issues and maybe CVI, which is cortical visual impairment, but a reminder that these are cortical visual impairments that our kids have as well. So the first thing would be, it kind of answers the question that someone asked earlier about the training of the teacher. Is this certificate even helpful to this child, right? I want to know more. So I did actually reach out to Dr. Linda Lawrence, who was the co-author on our vision guide. And she said, vision rehabilitation training is quite intensive, and it probably would be a good training. But again, you still need to make sure that they understand your child's visual impairment, right? So they might know a lot about a lot of visual impairments, but you might be the one educating your team about your child's visual impairments, right? We talked about that at the beginning, that it's sort of surprising that you need to do that, but you might need to do that. And you do need a teacher of a visually impaired or whoever it is in whatever service area, oops, sorry, touchy mouse, who's knowledgeable about the conditions and is trained in remediation of those conditions, right? I noted on this document that the assessment was 2 years old, so we would consider an updated assessment. And then down at item 5 on this sheet, it said that the peripheral vision was intact. So this is really important because if the child has had an occipital lobectomy or a hemispheric procedure, their central and peripheral vision is completely gone in the both eyes opposite the removed occipital lobe or hemispherectomy, et cetera. So I think this is an assessment that they did that showed that he was able to, it seemed like he was using his peripheral vision, but again, I would want the parent to write a statement explaining the vision loss. I will share some resources with you that we've created around vision loss because we don't have time to get into that today. And then, just some other examples here. I don't want to go into too much detail here. There's quite a lot, but I'm just sharing with you so you can see kind of some of the questions I might ask. I'm not going to do a deep dive in goals, but you will note at the top here that I note that most of the goals I like to see written with 90% accuracy in 5 out of 5 trials over a 6-week reporting period. We do have a goals spreadsheet, which I'll share with you so you can get a look at what those would be. The recommendation here was that this child would benefit from 30 sessions a year. My question is, would he benefit from 4 15-minute sessions a week, 3 20-minute sessions a week instead of 1 60-minute session a week? I came across something when I was creating this presentation in the law that says that it has to, the duration of the session has to be appropriate for the child's attention based on their age or disability. So if they're saying, nope, you can only have 60 minutes once a week, that might not be appropriate for your child, and you want to step in there. And again, we're thinking about the GAS, the goal, accommodation, and service. So a lot of these highlights are just considering that. Down at the bottom, I noted that he needs to be continually assessed for appropriate text size, and the recommendations of the TVI should be part of the IEP. Our kids are really unique, and if we're not doing ongoing assessment, we're going to miss a lot of things. And then there was just like a lot of lack of specificity in these recommendations. And again, just kind of more here about, what would you correct? I noted at the top here, I asked the parents some questions, and they were basically saying he's capable of moving around his environment safely, but the parent says, well, no, actually he is, but when he comes to a complicated visual environment or in a challenging environment to navigate, he'll actually stop, he'll slow down, he'll reach for a hand on uneven surfaces. That I would add that parent input as part of the IEP. And again, I don't want to go into every single note here. I will be sharing these slides with you so you can take a look and see, but you get the idea that we have dissected this present levels. We're asking a lot of questions. It should take a long time to go through the present levels. You might have an IEP meeting where all you talk about is the present levels. If the team is rushing you and saying, we need to do the whole IEP in an hour, and your child has multiple disabilities, that's not going to happen. It's not possible to do that. Look at how long it's taken for us. We haven't even gotten through a few pages of this child's present levels. We haven't really even talked about it fully. So again, an example of parent input that you might put in, some more examples of present levels. I'm just going to get through this section and then I'm going to pause and say, see you next week. I'll just end with what is a bad PLAF statement, and we'll pick up here next week. And I'm going to just also pause now and see if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask before we sign off. There was a question in the chat. I'm getting nowhere near this level of data in our goals and goal progress, even though I thought our goals indicate a specific number of assessments. In our last IEP, I got a single measurement to back up the assessment goal was met. I was told they're not legally required to provide this data. In terms of legally required, I am not going to weigh in on that. Julie might be a good person to answer that if you're still here. And I'm going to talk about goals and goal progress in the next part of this, but I also want to do just a whole power hour on goals and goal progress because it's a big, big, big topic and it's not something we can answer here. Does anyone else have a last question before we go and sign off until next week?
Yeah, hi. I have one question, quick question.
Yes.
So yeah, I joined a little late, something just came up. So yeah, thank you so much for letting me in. So I have a question regarding, I have my 7-year-old son. So who has testing done when he was 3-year-old, and then he developed the epilepsy around 5-year-old when he transitioned to the kindergarten, and then we did him a spectromy last year, January, and since the day of surgery, he's fine, no seizure, knock on the wood. So now, and he's schooling now, he's going consistently in the school. So shall I tell them to do his testing because it's all outdated when he was like 3-year-old, So shall I tell them to do a new, all the testing, his present level?
Yeah. Have you watched our assessments webinars on YouTube? We have a 5-part series on the IEP process and assessments.
No, I think so. No, I missed it. So it
Okay,
will be.
I will send you, I'll include, that was included in the registration, but I'll send you the link. So for everyone, if your child has epilepsy surgery or a repeat epilepsy surgery or develops hydrocephalus or has other major medical intervention, they need a repeat comprehensive evaluation. I know that's heartbreaking to hear, especially when there's a lot of evaluations potentially. And also 4 years is too long. 3-4 years is too long to go. 3 years, legally the law says evaluations have to be done every 3 years at a minimum. That means if the child has something happen like a hemispherectomy, the parent can go to the IEP team and said, my child had half of his brain removed. He now needs to be reevaluated in all areas of suspected disability. So I will also include, when I share resources with you today, after today's session, the link to our letter, which is a sample letter on how to request reevaluation. Or an individual IEE, independent education evaluation. If the school had done a recent evaluation and it wasn't comprehensive, you would use that letter. I'm also going to include a letter from the neurologist or neurosurgeon, which outlines, it's a letter you can give to your child's neurologist or neurosurgeon, modify it for your child and ask them to sign it. And you submit it to the school with your request for evaluation together, because the letter from the neurologist or neurosurgeon supports the need for all the evaluations you're going to ask for. And Julie commented that they are required to provide you with updated present levels that are sufficient to develop measurable goals. So the person who asked that question about progress and goals, we will talk about this more next week. And then virtual learning plan, emergency planning. Yes, I will try to touch on this next week. And then Julie also on the progress monitoring. The law says a single data point is not sufficient. So going back to your question, Tasneem, I hope I'm saying your name right.
Yeah, sure.
If your school does one assessment in the child's visual impairment, is that a comprehensive evaluation? No, because the law says a single data point is not sufficient. If your team does one measure of reading, is that a comprehensive evaluation? No, because the law says a single data point is not sufficient for each area of eligibility, for each area of need. That means we're looking at, you'll see when you get the letter of what would be included in that comprehensive evaluation. And I know we're over time, so anyone who needs to jump off, please do, and this will be on the recording. But you want to make sure that the comprehensive evaluation includes multiple measures in each area being evaluated. So if a child had speech only for their IEP, and I use that because that's a very common IEP, speech only, they would have to be assessed with multiple measures, looking at articulation, fluency, pragmatics, communication, language use, multiple measures for each of those areas just for speech, or that would not be a valid comprehensive evaluation. So we have to do that times 15 to get all of the areas of evaluation for our kids. You can't build the IEP, as I stated before, and I know you missed the beginning, Tasneem, so please watch the recording. PLAFMAN holds up your IEP, and PLAFMAN is fed by the evaluations. If you don't have good, robust, comprehensive evaluation data, you cannot build a good IEP, period. It's not possible. So I'm going to end there. Thank you all. I will send out a meeting link for part 2. We'll do it next Thursday at 10. I'm sorry if it doesn't work for all of you, but it will be recorded and you can watch it later. Julie chimed in on safety and emergency planning being a required part of the IEP. Absolutely. And I will see you all next week. Thank you for joining, and I'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye. Feel free to email me questions as well. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.